Hello, my name is Morgan, and I will be presenting Gaming Sexism, Gender and Identity in the Era of Casual Video Games by Amanda C. Cote. So we'll begin by addressing some of the aims and goals that Gaming Sexism aims to discuss. And it starts out by really addressing what she means by gaming sexism and what she really wants to accomplish through the interviews that Cote conducted and the participants she recruited from online areas and also drawing on her own personal network. And she wishes to use the experiences of these women who see themselves as standard everyday gamers who choose to enter the gaming spaces before they were quote unquote normalized for everyone. And so the goal of this study is to address female gamers' diverse encounters with gaming in the casualized era. And throughout this presentation, we'll discuss how Cote breaks down casual gaming versus core gaming, and as well as her discussion of core gaming remaining a space defined in masculine terms where the assumed identity of the gamer is male, and overt sexism versus inferential sexism, which Cote calls on Hall's theory of overt racism and inferential racism and how she uses that some framework to discuss what she means by overt sexism and inferential sexism. So first we'll begin by discussing what Cote really wants to convey when she's discussing gender and identity. So she draws on some cultural theorists that posit gender and identity more broadly. And to begin, we'll discuss Michel Foucault and his discursive practices. So what he discusses is that identities do not necessarily have inherent meaning. Rather, their significance is constructed through discourse, meaning interactions with others, society, and culture with language. And she also draws upon Stuart Hall in his discussion of identities and saying that people are made up of a wide variety of identity components rather than a single unified self. And identity in this way becomes performative, and it's something we act out or do rather than something we are. And from acting out, she calls on an idea of gender being performative by Judith Butler, and how Butler's discussion of one does not need to be quote unquote biologically sexed female in order to, say, perform femininity. And the same goes for if someone wanted to perform traditional considered traits of masculinity if they are not biologically sexed male. And so she continues with calling on theorists by calling on Antonio Gramsci, and she borrows the term crisis of authority and applies it to her discussion of the dichotomy between core gaming and casual gaming. And so what Antonio Gramsci discusses is that hegemonies are not actually natural. They are built through, again, social, cultural, and political systems. And Cote discusses the passive revolution as well as the crisis of authority. She mentions the passive revolution in saying that a dominant group will engage in what she says Gramsci calls making small concessions to the oppressed to limit the scope of changes and maintain overall control. And then following that, Gramsci argued that the crisis of authority was the time when the impression of common sense would slip away and the established order would no longer be taken for granted. And at this moment, the ruling group would resort to pure force to maintain power. And we'll see how this connects to her discussion of core and casual gaming as we move on. So theorizing the casualized era. Cote uses Gramsci's crisis of authority to discuss core and the relationship between core gaming and casualized gaming. Core discusses that forces are working in order to uphold gaming's existing masculinized nature. And previously, hegemonic male gamers have a fear of losing their privileged position in gaming spaces. And so as a result of this, male gamers may lend to different mechanisms in order to cope with this fear of losing this position in gaming spaces, such as seeing the rise in casualized game and being scared that maybe later developers will focus more on casualized games and not as much on quote unquote core games that are typically seen to need a console or a specific amount of time or a specific skill set in order to be successful at them. And so crisis of authority in general has two outcomes: the exertion of force for the subjected class to resume its position of powerlessness, or the success of the counter-hegemony. And so this is where we get more into the discussion of Cote's core versus casual. And so core and casual embody the struggle between the dominant forces of gaming's existing structural forces. And we talked a little bit earlier about casual gaming and its targeted audience, or its assumed targeted audience, which can be anybody who is not traditionally assumed or considered to be belonging to the gaming community, which would highlight anybody who's not typically white, gendered, male, and as well as having casual games being presented as less time commitment and possibly involving less, say, investment with specific games and how much money some games cost or some game consoles cost. And casual gaming really aimed to make gaming accessible to audiences they may not have assumed were out there. So Cote says that core and casual are not just set up as different offerings, rather, industrial and player discourses try to establish a hierarchy whereby core is validated and casual is dismissed. And core and casual are extremely complicated terms that encompass many different elements at once. And we'll get into this a little bit later as well, with platform, time investment, the player's gender, and hardcore casual that she quoted by Mia Consalvo. And so an example I wanted to give of core versus casual is she also uses this example of the game Going Home. And with the game Going Home, it was an interactive story game in which the playable character returns home from a year-long trip to find her house empty and her family gone. And as she investigates this house, she finds objects and clues that reveal her sister's relationship with a girl from school, and eventually explores deep questions about relationships, family, sexuality, and coming out. And so while this is not considered by many to be a game that somebody would invest time in playing if they weren't considered to be a core gamer, another game like Minecraft, it doesn't have a necessarily object to the game or any hard penalties. If you die, you are able to come back to life over and over again. But this is where she sees that this sandbox game, like Gone Home, does not necessarily have a way for the player to fail or combat or puzzles for a player to face. Its gameness is rarely or never questioned in the way that Gone Home's has been. And this might be because of the underlying story context that Gone Home offers as a different way for other gamers who want to experience a different type of game to play in. And so casual's threat to core. Gamers who are used to being in the industry's sole concern saw their own importance threatened. So the rise in popularity of casual games, developers targeted other markets, and many core gamers and producers experienced real, deeply felt anxiety about what their role in gaming would be, in light of the new phenomenon of, say, mobile and casual games. So industrial changes have undermined the expectation that gaming only exists to target a core audience and that the best games come out of core studios. And casual games intended to attract an audience that was not assumed to be interested in gaming, as we've mentioned earlier. And this also challenges what a good game looks like. So changes in the casualized industry, such as stagnating console technology, rising mobile technology, and the growth of new distribution and funding mechanisms. So breaking down the binary, the association of casual and core games with different audiences serves as a discursive attempt to maintain an unequal hierarchy of power in gaming by separating the traditional white male market from newer, broader audiences. And so this attempts to define core games as the more serious and important segment of the gaming community, which we've mentioned may call for more time devotion, harder games. And core is a flexible and paradoxical concept. For each player indicator of what core is, there is an example of a game or player that determines that definition. So for example, when we mentioned earlier about platform, if core is decided by platform, with PC games, for example, and console games as the locus of core, then solitaire and Wii Sports should also be included. Or if core is determined by players' gender, skillful women interviewed for, say, this study would be ignored or left out, while many male players would be included regardless of playstyle, game preferences, or skill level. And this is how she shows the flexibility of these boundaries, allows subordinated players to take on some core characteristics while ignoring or deliberately avoiding others. And so this is a necessary step in breaking down and altering gaming's current gender hierarchy by denaturalizing it and showing how it can be constructed in different and more inclusive ways. And then this is when we'll go into the overt versus inferential sexism. So Cote draws on Stuart Hall's concepts of overt and inferential racism to categorize exclusionary forces in gaming according to their overt and inferential sexism. Overt sexism is obviously sexist themes or actions, such as what we see in gaming development with the lack of female characters or the hypersexualization of female characters and direct harassment of female players in gaming social spaces. Inferential sexism are sexist aspects of gaming's culture that work to hold up the inherently sexist nature, such as content themes, audience members, industry trends. And this rests deeply in the naturalized assumptions that gamers should be men. And then there is also the girl gamer stereotype, which assumes that girls are possibly going to be included in gaming for different reasons. And some girls will either have trouble identifying with other girl gamers because of this. To say, for example, if one girl gamer assumes this other girl gamer is there just to get specific attention from the male-dominated space that she is included in. And so players generally assumed one or two things about female gamers. They were either casual players who avoided difficult games, or they played men's games such as first-person shooters as a way, again, to get attention from male players. And this is a form of inferential sexism that divides male and female players and makes women struggle with their game choices, interactions with male players, and connections to female players. And overt sexism and inferential sexism reaffirm the masculinized core of gaming, requiring females to assume multiple and contradictory subject positions in order to navigate gaming spaces. And so Cote also breaks down some strategies for play that her interviewees have taken upon in order to navigate these gaming spaces. And we actually read one of these in our classes earlier this semester, and it's I Can Defend Myself, Mechanisms for Coping with Online Harassment. And so Cote breaks down 5 main strategies that her interviewees basically took upon. So one of them was leaving online gaming. Another was avoiding playing with strangers, camouflaging their gender, deploying their skill and experience, and adopting an aggressive persona. So leaving online gaming is leaving the space where you know you will have to interact with other players, and there's that unknown of who you'll come across and what type of attitudes or different experiences you will also be playing with. And this falls in line with avoiding playing with strangers. If you don't know what somebody is going to react to you, like for a female gamer, they can either be surprised and then act different towards you in the game if you're a female, and not necessarily focus on the game itself, which can be frustrating, as Amanda says, from responses from her participants. And so in order to do that, they also camouflage their gender and don't necessarily make it known, if they can in any way, that they're not playing as a woman or how they identify. And so deploying their skill and experience, when they reveal that they are women, their strategies move from avoiding harassment or to stopping it or finding ways to brush it off. And so for this purpose, many women rely on their skill and experience. So if somebody is harassing them, they would laugh it off as jealousy or pointed out how their history with games or their skill level surpassed that of the negative player. Or they adopted an aggressive persona. So that way they would come off as strong or not being able to be fazed by something that somebody says. And Cote's participants also draw on 4 main resources to evaluate games and choose appropriate offerings. And this also is somewhat similar to what she talks about with their coping mechanisms and dealing with online harassment. So their personal skill set, their skills that they have with what games they're going to engage in, and the knowledge of developer or genre conventions, previews of game content, and social network recommendations. So they'll use these different resources to evaluate which games they want to participate in, and they'll choose which appropriate things fall in line with their own reasons for gaming. And so the conclusion falls in hegemony is still a pervasive force that can be difficult to undermine and change effectively. In many ways, gaming's core remains a masculinized space, policed by exclusionary content trends. The direct harassment of female gamers and other, quote, outsiders, surprise at diverse players' presence, and stereotypes about girl gamers. Because of this, sexism and misogyny in gaming are legitimated, and even at times celebrated. These forces can extend to affect other cultural areas that Cote discusses. And some of these other cultural areas are some things like the rise in white supremacy that we have seen in response to movements like the Black Lives Matter movement or other cultural movements that are relevant within the women's movement. And so promoting and normalizing diverse play styles might be the first step towards change and decreasing value judgments about what is quote unquote the right way to play the game or what is quote unquote the right reason for being part of gaming communities. An example of this is if a woman who identifies as a player wishes to, say, draw on her sexuality and flirt with other male players in order to get what she wants, that doesn't necessarily need to be looked down upon by other female gamers and shunned upon in order to further enhance the quote-unquote girl gamer stereotype. And industry members and journalists need to be held more accountable for perpetuating discourses that make sexism both normal and acceptable in gaming spaces. Developers should also improve their focus on diversity in games because players deeply enjoy experiencing different types of identification. This is to say that regardless if you are a female gamer or a male gamer, Cote discusses that if you're a gamer, it has been shown that you ultimately appreciate getting to play as any type of different identity. And it's not necessarily necessary to push the, say, quote unquote, binary of having to choose between a male avatar and a female avatar. And Cote ultimately ends with, it is impossible to predict which direction the casualized era will end up taking because of the change that we have not yet seen to come, although Cote still remains hopeful. Some critique and limitations that Cote also discusses in her book, and some that I agree with as well. It is unclear from Cote's targeted interviews on the impact of the rise of casual games on players of color and or LGBTQ+ or disabled players. So greater attention to intersectionality would also be useful, as most of the participants for Cote's study were white and spoke primarily about their experiences as women. And future projects should aim to pursue a deeper understanding of men's fear about industrial change. And this will ultimately highlight some of the different dichotomies between men's identities and how they identify with gaming. And if there's men who say, take on those harassing roles and harass women or other players versus the men who say maybe act nicer to women because they are women, and just kind of overlaying and interviewing men who play games to kind of discover some of the underlying notions between what a male identifies within his gaming practices. And future research should also move outside of a Western context, because there is a lot to be learned about different gaming industries, especially Cote mentions like Japanese gaming. They have a lot of different androgynous players within a majority of, I want to say, most of their games now. And to explore that would also be very interesting in terms of what their gender relations may be between players and gaming and things of that nature. So thank you. We are at the end of this presentation, and I want to thank you for staying tuned, and I hope you liked it.